Hi everyone, I'm going to do my presentation here on measuring personality and looking at some of the epistemological problems. And this is basically a summary from my doctoral dissertation that I completed a few years ago. And so we learned in this class from Gallagher that every science is going to have a built-in epistemology. And when I completed my study a few years ago, I didn't really look at the epistemological problems associated with the study. And so now I'm engaging retrospectively on this critical reflection. And we learned from the class that every single science is going to have its own assumptions, procedures, and conclusions. In the case of scientific knowledge, we make all kinds of assumptions that have obviously some problems. And as we learn in the class, it might be on the theories or the models or some of the other limitations. And a few years ago, I was really interested in looking at various personality theories, and more specifically on the empirical models that have been developed to study personality. And I came across this very well-known now model of personality called the Big Five theory of personality, which basically proposes that personality can be measured or evaluated by looking at five dimensions: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion or introversion, agreeableness, and finally emotional stability or neuroticism. And the theory behind it is that all of us have some basic tendencies or predispositions. Some of these may be rooted in biology. We inherited some of these personality dimensions, and then those personality dimensions have adapted based in our interactions with the environment. We have external influences that are going to give expression to some of those personality aspects. And theoretically, the social scientists who came up with this model went to the unabridged dictionaries and they theorized that all of the descriptors of personality are going to be encoded in very specific adjectives or terms. And in our evolution, from an evolutionary psychological perspective, our personality became encoded linguistically in thousands and thousands of personality descriptors. And so they extracted all of these terms from the dictionary, and then through some statistical analysis, they summarized all of these descriptors related to personality into big five. And so once again, this is a theoretical model that has been empirically validated. And I included some descriptors here, descriptors of some of these general five aspects. You can see, for example, conscientiousness, it would be about how competent, orderly, dutiful, deliberate, or self-disciplined someone is. That is a very general personality facet. There is also agreeableness and, once again, neuroticism. These are big five aspects that are found across cultures. And the Big Five model of personality has been tested empirically in over 50 cultures. And the model has been replicated to the extent that even now there is a questionnaire that can be used to measure those big five aspects of personality called the NEO-PIR. And it has 240 items. It is administered to people, and then we're able to derive that big five model of personality. From a social science perspective, and now in terms of the epistemology, back then I was interested in investigating to what extent a model or a theory that is supposedly universal, replicable across cultures and peoples was really indigenously expressed in some other culture. And personality psychologists make a difference between the etic and the emic. And so that would be let's say, a model that was developed here in the United States, an outsider perspective, if we take that same model, theory, or personality instrument to another culture, how is that going to replicate? How is that going to express personality aspects that might be more indigenous to that culture? And so that would be looking at the emic perspective, because the assumption that has been made in psychology is that somehow there is this universal expression of the mind or of someone's personality. It's this universalizing tendency that psychology has had for years. And as I noted in the annotated bibliography, recently, indigenous psychologists and social scientists from other countries are questioning that. Really? Is there a universal expression of the mind, or there is more variability? Are there indigenous aspects that are not captured by theoretical models that are etic, that are from a more universal global perspective? And so I was very interested in looking at that more indigenous expression of personality. And so what I did, I selected Mexico, a country or a culture where the big five had not been tested previously. And most of the studies were with Asian samples, even samples from the African continent and some other cultures. And I decided to select this country, and I basically went down to Mexico and recruited a group of indigenous psychologists, and then I sampled close to a little bit over 800 participants in the northern part of Mexico, in the central area, and on the Yucatan Peninsula. I was interested in also having a representative sample across regions and geographies, and to a certain extent, some of the indigenous populations of this culture. And more specifically, I was really interested in knowing whether some of the indigenous questionnaires that indigenous psychologists have developed in this country are correlated, or to what extent they can be explained by the Big Five model of personality that is supposedly more universal. And I went ahead and collected the data in collaboration with indigenous psychologists, and then was able to study that sample and that data using some analysis and some statistics. And here I included some of the major descriptors of this sample: 794 college students. The mean age was about 19.8 years of age. All participants were indigenous or born in this culture, and some of the other specifics related to the geography. I then correlated all of these indigenous instruments that have been constructed and tested in the indigenous culture, and correlated that with the neo-PIR. And I was able to publish this scientific study in collaboration with the indigenous psychologists in their Journal of Research and Personality. And as we learned from Gallagher, in terms of scientific knowledge, it is measurable, statistical. I correlated all of these dimensions of personality. I was able to replicate the majority of the big five facets of personality. Here I included some of those numbers in bold. Those are the replicable dimensions from the study. I was able to obtain also some reliability measures on all of the instruments that are indigenous, and basically correlated a lot of these aspects measured by the indigenous and also by the Big Five theory of personality. And here is where I want to spend more time examining some of the epistemological challenges or problems that in retrospect I see with my study. So as you can see briefly from the slides, science is very quantifiable. It emphasizes correlates, measurements, statistical analysis of data. And once again, the assumption is that somehow science is going to identify some of these objects of study and basically bring a measurable lens on the data. And for my study, and as I collaborated with indigenous psychologists, we also adopted that very common perspective that we remain removed from the actual participants and the object of study. We adopt a spectator perspective. Gallagher challenges this approach because in some way reality is interactive, and scientists try to remain objective. And I noted on some of the posts that has major limitations. And the other limitation that I wanted to point out here is that in my case, we were informed by a theory, by a model that had been developed, and then we approached this population very much with that theory in mind. That is another major epistemological challenge, because our theory and our model is going to limit our perspective. Beyond the big five, even though I looked at the indigenous dimensions in analyzing the data, I stayed very much within those parameters of the big five. And so the other claim that we make in social science is that, hey, I'm looking at the bare facts, I'm looking at the data, and we're going to let the data speak for itself. And that is a major assumption that we make. It's not like just give me the facts. There is a lot of interpretation that is theoretically informed, obviously. And from an epistemological perspective, Gallagher speaks about the imperialism of method. In retrospect, I clearly see that. In fact, for publishing my results, I had to stay within a methodology. There is no wiggle room. You are questioned about any methodological lapses, or if you, in this case, even use some statistical analysis that are not allowed by the scientific community, in this case, the study of personality, they're not going to allow you to publish some of those results. You have to stay, as Gallagher put it, within the imperialism of method. And so the other related challenge to this is that here I went to an indigenous culture, supposedly with the open eye to see beyond the big five theory of personality. And when I sampled all of these indigenous measures that had been developed in Mexico, those instruments had actually the same format or very related format to the big five, the instrument that I was using from the United States. For example, the scales were a Likert scale going from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And they had other sort of instrumentalization format that is very limited, and that is not going to capture the reality beyond how the social scientist sees that. And so, in summary, I would say that there is an incomplete inductive knowledge that we derive using some of these methods and theories. We claim that we're making here a very general application of the big five, that it is replicable, that is cross-cultural, that can be used anywhere. But as Gallagher noted, there is a very incomplete inductive approach. It is going to only focus on that sample of about 800 participants, but really, can we generalize to the entire general Mexican population? That remains to be answered. I noted in the annotated bibliography that increasingly we have had challenges to this type of methodology. In both the social sciences and the hard sciences. Increasingly, we're questioning that type of concrete, measurable, statistical, highly empiricist approach that we're taking. Thank you. And I look forward to getting any comments or questions